Well, joining us at our table is Eric Vickers, Executive Director of the American Muslim Council. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here.
What is the American Muslim Council?
The American Muslim Council is one of the oldest Muslim political and civic organizations in the United States. It was founded by a number of people in 1990, and its mission is to promote American Muslims moving into mainstream America in the political arena, in the civic arena, in enterprise, and so on. And also, our mission is to educate America about Islam. For example, in the aftermath of 9/11, we mailed out to political leaders across the country, state, local, and federal, pamphlets about Islam just to familiarize them and educate them about the religion. So that's the role that we have played since its founding.
How many American Muslims are there, and how has the number changed over the years?
There are at least 7 million Muslims in this country at this time. You hear estimates as high as 10 million. Actually, Muslims first came to this country some 300 or 400 years ago with slaves. They were the early Muslims in this country. Some people may remember the movie Roots and how Kunta Kinte was a Muslim. So there's a long history. You've seen a virtual, I would say, explosion in the population in this century, a lot of immigrant Muslims coming. And then you have the indigenous Muslim population, if you will, which is largely African American in this country.
What does it mean to be a Muslim in this country?
I'm pleased you asked that question. What it means, essentially, is to believe in one God and one God only. It is the monotheistic faith. It has the same root and same belief as Christianity and Judaism. And there are what we call pillars of the faith in Islam, and there are 5 pillars. The first, as I mentioned, is the belief in one God and one God only, and the belief in all the prophets sent by God to deliver his word. And those include Jesus, Moses, Abraham, and we believe the final prophet, Muhammad, who came in and it was revealed to him the Quran, which is the Muslim scripture. So that's one of the pillars. Another is that Muslims are required to make prayer 5 times a day at different times of the day. A third is 1 month out of the year, the 9th month in the Islamic calendar, we fast. And that's during the month of Ramadan, when the Quran was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, as we say. We're also required to give a percentage of our savings each year to charity, and not just to Muslim charity, but all charities. And then lastly, the 5th pillar is that once in a Muslim's lifetime, if they're able, they're to make the pilgrimage to Hajj in Mecca.
Eric Vickers will be with us for about 40 more minutes, and we'll get those phone lines on the bottom of the screen for our guests. Republicans can call 202-585-3880. Democrats, 585-3881. And we have a special line on the bottom there for American Muslims. Like to get your viewpoint on things these days. 202-585-3882. Eric Vickers, you touched on 9/11 very briefly.
Yes.
What would you say are the biggest misperceptions about Islam in this country?
Oh, clearly that it's a terrorist, violent religion. This continuous association by the media with Islam and terrorism has really created a very negative stereotype about it. And so Muslims find themselves in a position often of having to defend themselves, to declare themselves as American and as offended by the events of 9/11, as all Americans were. So it's put the American Muslims in that sort of posture.
What is the purpose of your meeting? You got your annual convention taking place this week.
Yes, this is our 11th annual convention. And again, our purpose is to move Muslims into the mainstream of American life, and by the same token to have Americans acquainted with Islam. So in the course of our convention, which covers 3 days, then we have a number of topics that are discussed, domestic topics, issues. Muslims in America have the very same issues as all Americans. They want to be secure in their homes. They want to have good schools for their children. They want to have good medical care. So we discuss those issues, and then we discuss international issues as well.
Some of the news coming out of your meeting is here in the Washington Post, a photo of the FBI Director, Robert Mueller, addressing your organization yesterday. He thanked them for providing, quote, substantive assistance to the government investigation of the September 11th attacks. We will look at a brief clip from Robert Mueller and then come back in a moment to talk with Eric Vickers.
As I'm sure you're aware and has been mentioned, my appearance here today has created or generated some controversy. And while that certainly did not deter me from coming, as with most matters, I believe it is best to address it openly. And my reason for being here is simple. The reason for being here is to continue our discussion and to help build a relationship that I am convinced is beneficial to us all. But I also think it important to be open and frank about the concerns of those who urged me not to attend. Like all Americans, you were shocked and outraged by the terrorist hijackings, and you quickly condemned them. As Dr. Basha has said, echoing sentiments from across the nation, Muslim Americans felt violated by the attacks, and he wasted no time in denouncing those horrible acts in the strongest language possible. Thank you. Nonetheless, you've not always spoken with one voice. Unfortunately, persons associated with this organization have in the past made statements that indicate support for terrorism and for terrorist organizations. And I think we can, Muslims and non-Muslim alike, justifiably be outraged by such statements. No perceived political or other agenda justifies acts of terrorism. And we must be, as Dr. Basha is, loud in our condemnation of acts of terrorism.
Eric Vickers of the American Muslim Council, your reaction to Robert Mueller's speech?
Well, I thought his speech was very well balanced. What was more interesting was the controversy surrounding the speech. There were very overt attempts made to prevent him from coming. Adversaries of AMC tried to paint the organization as having some sort of links to terrorism, and so they made an active effort, a real campaign to drive a wedge between the Muslim community and the government. So that whole controversy was more interesting than the actual speech itself. And really what that boiled down to was their opposition to some of the policy positions taken by the AMC. We feel very strongly that there ought to be a Palestinian state, that there is a legitimate Palestinian resistance movement. We have consistently condemned all acts of terrorism by any organization, and we have named those organizations Hezbollah, when it has engaged in acts of terrorism, Al-Qaeda and Hamas. But we also say that we must condemn the acts of aggression by Israel, and that we must examine exactly what is going on from an American point of view to try to bring some sound resolution to that situation.
We go to the phones for Eric Vickers, head of the American Muslim Council, Lake Park, Florida. Our first call on the Democrats' line. Welcome.
Good morning. Peace to all. Forgive me if this question sounds hostile. I don't mean it that way at all. Is it fair to say that a lot of black people join the Muslim faith because they are so sick of everything white? That's my question. I want to listen to the answer. Go in peace.
Eric Vickers.
Thank you, and peace be unto you. No, that is not the case. When you examine the history of African Americans becoming Muslims in this country, as I mentioned, it really dates back to slavery and even before then. But there is something in Islam that appeals to African Americans, particularly African Americans who are involved in the, let's say, liberation struggle still of African American people. African Americans who still want to see changes brought about in this country into the various forms of discrimination. Islam has an appeal to them. Malcolm X, also known as El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz, represented that. He symbolized that sense of change and that sense of hope, and that came from the faith. So that is really what attracts African Americans to Islam, is that it represents and stands for justice, for social change, and for being someone willing to sacrifice for that.
Washington, D.C.
Good morning.
Good morning. You're on our third line for American Muslims, correct?
Yes. I'm concerned about many different things. First of all, in America, as I'm sure your guest knows, we are actually pitted one against the other by our differences. That's an American way of doing things. Secondly, there is the American arrogance to anything else that is not necessarily straight up American. Thirdly, we are blinded by the U.S. past acts against Muslims all over the world, and yes, against darker people all over the world. My question is, why is it that the Muslim Council here in America, the different Muslim organizations here in America, have not taken the time to get the money that we have, and put our ads on television, on radio, in the newspapers to let people know what America has done? We had an election in Alabama recently, and Mr. Hilliard went down. Nobody from the Muslim community stood up for him in his fight against the other opponent, who was backed by the Jewish and Gentile community. This is something that we must do for ourselves. And this is something that the Honorable Minister Louis Farrakhan has taught me. And I don't consider myself to not be a part of the Muslim community. And thank you for your answers. I'll take them off there.
Thank you. Can you begin by talking about the level of Muslim participation in American politics these days?
I would say it's reached a significant level. And what we're trying to do is to increase that level. When I first ran for United States Congress in 1994, I would travel throughout the country, going to different mosques and to different Muslim communities. And the level of political consciousness was very low at that point. As a matter of fact, in some mosques, there was the belief that it was what we call haram, forbidden for Muslims to participate in the political system, because it was seen as just corrupt. When I ran again for Congress in 2000, the picture had changed completely. Muslims know they have to participate in the political system, so it's not a matter of whether, but how. So there's a high degree of participation. The caller's question, though, is an excellent one, and what it goes to is the question of the involvement in America by Muslims in the political process. And what he has touched upon is the alliances and the linkages that must be established. He mentioned the campaign of Hilliard, and he went down to defeat. First, Muslims did play a role in that. There were funds raised for him, but not enough to counter the other effect. But it's an interesting dynamic, because historically there has been an alliance between the black community and the Jewish community. And in this case, it was very clear that money from the Jewish lobby went to defeat an African-American incumbent congressman. And there has been a growing rift in the African-American community and the Jewish community. The Racism and Reparations Conference that was to be held in Durban, it was the whole Israel Zionist issue that became a wedge there, the whole affirmative action question. So we have to be very careful how we move at this point. And the political alliances that are playing out now, I think you're going to see some things happening differently since 9/11.
How many Muslims in Congress?
None.
None?
None. There has never been a Muslim elected to the United States Congress. And that's one of the points that we make, is that there needs to be that representation.
Is there a reason why, in your view?
Well, several reasons. I think one, numbers. Two, just political maturity. And three, just now Muslims are beginning to mobilize and to think in those terms.
Let's go to Boston for Eric Vickers to our Republican line. Thanks for calling.
Hi, good morning. I was going to ask you also about the Earl Hilliard campaign, and I guess the tactic worked so well in Alabama that they're now going to try it in Cynthia McKinnon's seat in Georgia. I checked out the FEC information of the money that was coming in, and I'm kind of pleased to see that there's a lot of Arab names now going that are supporting Cynthia McKinnon, even though I don't particularly care for her politics. But I hope she succeeds in what she's doing. Thanks.
Want to speak to that?
Yes. Yeah, there will be a real massive effort to maintain Congresswoman McKinney's seat. And It's not just because she has been supportive of the Muslim community, but it is because of her right, our right to be able to speak out. And the issue of Israel has become an issue that is really driving divisions in this country. That issue became a profound issue in Hilliard's campaign as opposed to the issues in his district, because that was the whole basis for the money going to that. And we really need to step back in this country and view the situation, have a much more balanced approach to it, because its repercussions are playing out in a negative fashion right now.
Moving on to Baltimore, to our American Muslims line. Welcome.
I hope this doesn't bother you, but I've been imagining what you look like naked.
I think we're going to move on right to Philadelphia. Hello, Philly.
Yeah. First, I want to differentiate between American Muslims and Muslims from other parts of the world. When we speak of American Muslims, we say that they have been born and raised here in the U.S., where they are taught to respect and get along with other religions and other cultures of the world. But when we talk of Muslims from Middle East, India, Pakistan, and other countries, they are taught and bred up to kill, they're taught and to hurt other people, and Muslims all over the world are terrorists. Let's take an example of India. What problems are Muslims facing in India today? Nothing. They are treated equally as Hindus and Christians, which are a lesser minority than Muslims in India. There are only 3% of Catholics in India. But did we hear at any time they're being tortured or killed, or they kill another Muslim? This is only the part of Muslims where they are taught from their schools in the early childhood days, where they're taught that other religions are bad and they need to kill to survive. There is nothing harm for Muslims in India, but still we see so many destruction going on. I think we have to differentiate between American Muslims and Muslims from other parts of the world.
Eric Vickers, can you break down that 7 to 10 million? How many are from other countries who now live here?
Well, let me first say that that is, in Islam, we don't make that sort of differentiation. We don't have sex in Islam. What makes someone a Muslim, whether they are in Pakistan or in Saudi Arabia or in the United States, is their belief in one God and the belief in the Prophet Muhammad. So if someone is acting in a manner that is contrary to the teachings of Islam, the teachings of peace, the teachings of justice, then it is not fair to blame the religion for that and to continue to characterize the religion as a terrorist religion or one that's promoting killers. So let me be clear on that. Now, as far as a breakdown, studies are just now being done to show the breakdown. What it comes down to roughly is that of the 7 to 10 million Muslims in this country, approximately 1/3 are African American. You have a number, third from South Asia, and then you have the Arab countries in remainder. But you now have a significant number of Bosnian Muslims coming from Turkey and Eastern Europe, and it's the fastest growing religion in this country right now. And I tell you, it's a wonderful thing to see a group of Muslims. And at the luncheon yesterday with Director Moeller, we pointed this out, to look around the room, to see people from Africa, to see people from Pakistan, to see people from Malaysia, United States. When you see Islam, it's seeing the world.
Get another call, this one from San Antonio, I believe, on the Republican line. Hi.
Hi, how are you? Thank you for the opportunity.
Good morning.
No disrespect, but I've always believed that the Muslim religion is a sham religion.
Why do you feel that way? You still there? I think we lost San Antonio. I wanted him to elaborate, but any initial reaction, what he said?
You know, what amazes me is this nation, and we pride ourselves on our fine educational system, but how really ignorant we are about a religion that's over 1,400 years old, that is worshipped by 20% of the people of the world, that's 1.5 billion people, and yet we know so little about it. And it's because we know so little about it, ignorance breeds fear. And it is that fear that is causing people to have a real misunderstanding. You know, it astounds me how any person, person of faith, and we call ourselves that in this country. In fact, we get up in arms when there's a Supreme Court ruling says that you have to say in the Pledge of Allegiance, under God. We pride ourselves as being a nation under God, people of faith. And people who are true believers, then basically they will do what is right. They are commanded by God, by the Supreme Being, by the power that compels them to do what is right. And so we would never engage in bashing another religion, to bash Christianity or to bash Judaism. In fact, Islam, in coming into the world, always greatly respected the other religions, protected the other religions, had alliances with the other religions. When you look at, for example, Jerusalem, when the Muslims came in to take over Jerusalem, they didn't kill anybody. They didn't tell the Christians to leave or the Jews to leave. But when the Crusades came, they killed the Christians. They killed the Muslims and the Jews. And now we look at Jerusalem now, and Israel is just taking over everything there now. So it is not within the character or nature of Islam to bash other religions. And when I hear those like the caller making those kind of statements, then I wonder if he is really a true man of faith.
Talk to us more about a sketch of American Muslims. You talked about political participation. Talk about economics. Do Muslims own many businesses? Level of education? You talked about civic participation. Take us through that if you can.
Thank you. And it's a point worth noting that Muslims are involved in everyday life in America, in businesses and in corporations, on the streets, at all levels of the sector of the economy, you find Muslims. It is only since September 11th where it's become heightened, and Americans have become much more aware of those. But in virtually every facet of American life, you find American Muslims.
Would our general audience recognize any names of prominent Muslim Americans?
Well, that's a good question. I think that generally not. I think that the names that are given, I think someone mentioned Minister Louis Farrakhan. I think one of the callers did. I think people see that name. But of course, America has painted a negative image of Louis Farrakhan. But in the United States, we have to be respectful of those who are put before as the leadership and their views. And he needs to be respected for the views and the voice that he has brought to this country.
Memphis, Tennessee, to our Democrats line with Eric Vickers, head of the American Muslim Council. Good morning.
Yes, good morning, sir.
Good morning.
I wanted to mention a couple of points to Mr. Vickers. As an African American, I wanted to remind him that there were two sticking issues that were not solved during the Clinton administration. One was the right of the Palestinians to return, and the other had to do with how Jerusalem would be divided as to the capital of Palestine, the capital of Israel, etc. These issues are uniquely Palestinian and Israeli issues. The African-American community is diverse and wide. Some of us are Baptists and some of us are Muslim, but it really does not involve religion. This has involved some political struggles. The African-American community is impacted by this in the way of refugees and those persons who are resettling in America. Those persons who happen to be Palestinians or from wherever in the Middle East are invitees of the State Department. They are not here because African Americans invited them. My point is, I think it is not correct for you, sir, and I understand that you are a paid director for an organization, but I think the African American community fights its own battles. Minister Farrakhan fights his own battles. The Palestinians will fight their own battles and have to have their own representatives. We cannot commingle our struggle for justice, economic justice in America, with this particular issue. It is not a question of Islam, of Muslims, and you have said that over and over again, and I understand the organization which you represent. But I think it's one of the things, there's an attempt to draw the African-American community in this. This is not our fight. What we have to insist upon is what is the total impact economically upon the African-American community with respect to the resettlement of the Palestinians.
Thanks, Eric Vickers.
Well, I guess I understand his point, but I would disagree. And incidentally, Minister Louis Farrakhan did make a trip to the Middle East in order to try to bring about a resolution to the situation. There are times in the history of the world and mankind, to be a little bit philosophical, where issues cross the line from being political issues to being moral issues. And I think what the world is looking at right now is a moral crisis that is occurring in Palestine. It is a potentially explosive moral situation. There are massacres that are occurring there. There is devastation. The United Nations has declared there are a people who are under occupation. They are under oppression. Their situation is no different than the condition of the Africans under the South African apartheid regime. And African Americans in the United States fought that cause for South Africa. And African Americans in the United States were instrumental in having the United States government impose sanctions on the South African government, which brought about the liberation of Mandela. I would never confine the African American community here to just addressing its own particular issues in the community, because the African American community here, from Martin Luther King to Malcolm X, always stood for justice, always stood to represent justice. That is what we embody. That is what we reflect. The own struggle of African American people was born out of that sense. So we have, I think, a duty when moral issues are before us to set a standard out there. That does not mean we neglect the many problems that affect the black community right now. But we set that tone.
15 minutes left with our guest. He is Eric Vickers, Executive Director of the American Muslim Council. How long has the council been in operation?
Since 1990.
How is it funded?
Membership, mostly. We have membership drives and we have fundraising drives.
Where are you from?
St. Louis, Missouri.
And you said you ran
Actually, originally from East St. Louis, Illinois.
And
we draw a little distinction.
Sure. And you said you ran for Congress twice. From which state?
Missouri, 1st Congressional District.
Will you run again?
Well, only time will tell. I have no immediate plans.
Let's go to Long Island. Hello. Long Island?
Hello, good morning, sir.
Good morning.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.
Brother, I started reading the Quran almost 10 years now. And I find out, like, from the Quran, like the justice for weaker and the powerful, and even in the enemy, it should be the same justice. And if our governments are doing the same thing, then we are on the right path. Otherwise, we're not on the right path.
Eric Vickers, respond to that?
If what he is saying is, well, what I see him as saying is that we need to make sure our government acts in a just way. When I say we, I mean the American Muslims, and I guess all American citizens do. And there's some great concerns about whether or not our government is acting in a just manner right now. Not only in the way it's conducting its foreign policy, which seems to be completely out of kilter, it's certainly out of sync with what the rest of the world thinks, but also how we conduct ourselves domestically. The eradication of civil liberties in this country right now should be frightening to all Americans. The attack on being able to have a counsel, the fact that one can be arrested and not even charged, not even allowed to have a judge or a jury, and to be able to be detained and not have one's whereabouts even known. These are elements that are going to be destructive to America in the long run. And we need to address these issues now.
How does the council make its voice heard to the folks here, the folks in Washington, the folks at the White House? What do you do? How do you do it?
We meet with them. We engage in our own form of lobbying on the various issues. As part of our convention 2 days ago, we had a lobbying session, the opening day. We come Capitol Hill, we meet, we had presentations, and then we went out to meet the various legislators, those who are on particular issues, and then those who are from the home district of the people who've come here for the convention, because they've come across the country.
We've been asking folks lately about their level of faith and trust in the U.S. government. Again, it's hard to crystallize 7 to 10 million people, but does the council, do American Muslims trust the government here?
They want to, and they had a great deal of trust, I would say, before 9/11. But since that time, I think it would almost be a little strange for them to be trustworthy, given the things that have happened. I mean, institutions that the Muslims have trusted here, charitable organizations like the Holy Land Fund. The government says it has a link to terrorism, bam, it shuts it down. No proof is really offered. No due process to give them a chance to rebut the charges. We've had homes here in this area raided. These are reputable, credible people, outstanding American citizens, have their homes raided, records seized. No chance to really dialogue with the government before this happens, just total disrespect and mistreatment. So yes, there's a distrust that's there, legitimately so. And it's interesting that this is what, the 30th anniversary of Watergate? That's a very good lesson for us, that we should never be blind and trusting of the government. If the government says that someone is a terrorist, the government needs to present to the American people some sort of proof. It needs to stop hiding behind this secrecy that, well, in the interest of security, we cannot reveal information. That's what Nixon did. That's what got this country in trouble.
Moving on to Detroit on our Republican line. You're on with Eric Vickers. Hi.
Yes, hello. I wanted to, well, first, 2 points. First of all, as far as the civil liberties issue goes, try being a practicing Christian in any Muslim country in the Middle East and see what happens to you. And you're going to preach about civil rights. And since you're so interested in being accurate and being aware of the history of Muslims in the United States, I have in front of me a copy of the autobiography of Malcolm X. I'm sure you're familiar with him. He was a Muslim, was he not?
Yes, he was.
Okay. Well, on pages 164 through pages 167 in this autobiography, he explains how Elijah Muhammad developed his theory, his unique theory of Islam, and about how it was black people who created light-skinned, blue-eyed devils, and I quote, savages, nude and shameless, hairy like animals and walking on all fours. Perhaps you could go into a little bit of the history of the Muslim movement in America among African Americans.
Eric Vickers.
Well, if you would read further in Malcolm's book, then you would see him talking about Christianity and its relationship with the African Americans. You will see Malcolm talk about how in the name of Christianity, Africans were enslaved, they were brutalized, they were lynched, had their genitals cut off, churches bombed, a whole campaign, a whole history of terrorism carried out against African Americans by this Christian nation. And I say that to say that we have to be very careful about labeling masses, groups of people or organizations. We have to judge a religion by what it stands for. And those who fail to follow it and stand up for it, then we look at them apart from the religion.
Here's a fax. With Islam's position against charging interest, how does a good Muslim operate in the modern U.S. economy? First of all, is that true about interest?
Yes. Interest is considered forbidden, and it's because the belief is that one should, whatever one earns, should be, the income that one receives should be something that one earns, not something that is by some sort of chance or without any work. So that's the sort of the basis of it. It's a little more complicated than that. But there are, in fact, on the Dow Jones, there are a listing of stocks that can be bought that meet all Islamic criteria. And they're doing very well, incidentally.
Brooklyn, New York. Thank you for calling. Hello.
Hi. I am really offended by Mr. Vickers' mischaracterization of Islam. First place, as is well known, the Quran instructs that infidels, non-Muslims, should be converted, or if not converted, killed. And Muhammad himself was a warrior, as unlike Christ, who was a man of peace. In fact, he conquered the Arabian Peninsula by subjugating those people who wouldn't convert to Islam. In fact, the city of Medina, allegedly the second holiest city in Islam, was predominantly a Jewish city in the year 600, and when the Jews wouldn't convert to Islam, they were slaughtered. Further, he talks about the Muslims teaching peace in Muslim schools in Saudi Arabia, throughout the Middle East, and to a lesser extent in the Muslim schools in the U.S. They teach that Jews are descendants of pigs and monkeys. Lastly, I should point out that it was Arab Muslim slave traders who enslaved the blacks in Africa and then sold them to British traders who then brought them to the U.S. And as we all know, in Sudan, predominantly a Muslim country, slavery still exists today. So let's hear how Mr. Vickers responds to these items.
Mr. Vickers.
Yes, I mean, it just amazes me how there is so disrespect for a religion that is 1,400 years old and worshipped by 1.5 billion people in the world, and to say that they're all terrorists and crazy. So let's be very clear what Islam stands for. First, if the caller or anyone would read the Quran and study it, actually, and in Islam we're encouraged to read, to study, to think, to know. It says very explicitly and very clearly in the Quran, there is to be no coercion in matters of faith. We have a saying in Arabic, lakum din kuyu din, to you be your way, to me be my way. So Muslims have never tried to coerce their religion upon someone else. He mentioned Jesus Christ as being a man of peace. Well, if you read the Bible, Jesus Christ said, I came not to bring peace, but a sword. Now, does that make him violent? No, it takes it out of context. Muslims revere the prophet Jesus. So he is one of the pillars of the faith. The whole notion of slavery, Islam freed the slaves. One of the third convert to Islam was a slave. And an African American from Ethiopia, Bilal, was a treasure. He was revered. He was a slave. Islam liberated people from their oppression, and they were persecuted in the early days for that, but they withstood the persecution because they had the faith and they had the belief. And that is why today this religion still persists, despite those who have closed minds, distorted minds, as it appeared the caller did.
One of our questions earlier this week stemmed from an opinion piece that we asked the question whether radical, define the term radical imams should be allowed in prisons to preach to prisoners. What do you think about that?
Well, I don't know what's meant by radical Islam. I'm very leery of those terms because I recall in the 60s and 70s, that's how they labeled the blacks who were struggling for voting rights, for the right to be free from discrimination. They called Stokely Carmichael, later Kwame Ture, radical. They called H. Rap Brown, they called King radical, Malcolm X radical. It was a way of discrediting them in order to try to prevent the message. So I'm not sure what is meant by radical Islam or radical imams, but what I am sure about is that in this country we do have a First Amendment, and people do have the right to speak out, and they do have the right to disagree with their government, and that is what is at danger now. If you disagree with the government, if you don't stand up and salute the flag and say Pledge of Allegiance, then it seems that you might quickly be labeled a terrorism. Because in fact, one of the questions that's been asked of people that have been rounded up is how do they feel about the government?
Does the government have a right to show up at a mosque somewhere in this country without pursuing an active case? That was one of the big stories recently, just to observe.
No. That's a definite intrusion. That's a definite intimidation. I mean, this country was founded on the belief that people would be free to worship their religion. Can you imagine the founding fathers saying, yes, you can bring your army and stand in front of our church and observe as long as we don't touch it? No, that's not the role of the government. If there is proof, we need to adhere to basic constitutional standards. If there is proof, probability of a crime, the sound basis that exists, then the government can go into operation and use all the apparatus necessary to combat any sort of crime.
Last call for Eric Vickers from Suitland, Maryland, just outside Washington, on our American Muslims line. Hi.
Hi, assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
I would just want to express what Islam is going through in America in reference to the Catholic Church is also going through in America. Your commentary is white. He looks Catholic. But if I kept my kids away from him just because of a stereotype of a few bad apples, look at what America is claiming they are. Now, the media has never came against the Catholic Church as hard as they did 9/11. Those kids are ruined for life. And to give them an economic payment to say, well, the Catholic Church should not be investigated as deep as the Islamic faith is being investigated, I see a bias that we've been talking about for the last 400 years, And because most of the Congress and media are Catholic, so then they're going to take on a side that may be more liberal toward their own kind. And when we express this in an intelligent way, because we're Muslims, that gives us the right not to be heard. What do you feel about that?
Final thought from our guest.
Actually, I could not articulate it any better. He's pointing out the double standard that exists. And really what I see right now is America having to, in a historical moral circle, face itself. It is now faced with whether or not it's going to really live up to its own constitution and its own civil liberties. And to say that we're in an environment now of terrorism, we have to suspend that, that doesn't work. The character of a nation really comes out in a crisis. So America is having to face that. America and the media has been painting this picture of Islam, and now we see what's going on, as the caller pointed out, in the Catholic Church. Are Catholics going to be similarly branded in the same way that Muslims have been branded? So America is coming face to face in the historical circle with itself, and the challenge is before it to live up to its creed. And I think this is where Muslims in America can play a great role. They can make the great ideas that this country stands for, the democracy, the freedom, the civil liberties, they can make those real.
Eric Vickers is Executive Director of the American Muslim Council. They're just finishing up their conference here in Washington, D.C. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. I appreciate it very much.
Okay. In a couple of minutes, or actually in about a half an hour, on this Washington Journal, look at women in politics.